Someone wants to know what's the difference between short-term and long-term capital gains?
So short-term capital gains is capital gain is a gain or loss on a capital asset. So a capital asset is something that does not get consumed within a year. If you buy a computer, for example, typically those will be depreciated over 5 years. Cars, typically 5 years. Rental real estate for residentials, 27 and a half years, and all those kind of things. As opposed to paper. Paper you buy and you consume it, so it becomes an expense and it's not capital. I just got a shipment of paper in the office here today. So a capital gain or capital loss is a gain or loss on a capital asset. And so whether it's long-term or short-term depends on if you held that asset for less than a year, short-term, greater than a year is long-term. So if you have short-term capital gains, then those get taxed at whatever your ordinary rate is. So let's say you're in the 24% bracket, your short-term capital gains rate is going to be 24%. If you're in the 35% bracket, your capital gains rate, short-term capital gains rate is going to be 35%. Long-term capital gains are advantaged in the tax code because you pay a lower rate than your ordinary rate. So it's either going to be zero. I'm just talking federal here. It's either going to be 0%, 15, or 20%. There might be an extra kicker depending on your overall income of 3.8%. That's one of the Obamacare taxes, the net investment income tax. Basically, it can be anywhere from 0% up to 23.8% federally for long-term capital gains tax. Now, however you cut it, it ends up being about half of your ordinary rate because the brackets are offset, so that's not exact, but just ballpark kind of figures. So long-term capital gains sounds like a good idea, and sometimes it is, but sometimes it isn't. So here's the thing about long-term capital gains. This is the only place in the tax code where you are paying current dollars on old inflated away dollars. So let's say you bought something for $1,000 in 1980. So we've got like retired people who have held stock forever. So in fact, let me show this. If you go to the BLS, which is the Bureau of Labor Statistics, they have an inflation calculator. bls.gov/data/inflation_calculator.htm. So this guy right here. So let's say you bought something for $1,000 in 1980, okay? And then you sold it for $10,000 in 2025, 1980. Or let's say December 2024. Okay. $1,000 45 years ago has the same buying power as $4,000 today, but you would pay long-term capital gains on $9,000 worth of gain. But inflation adjusted, you only had $6,000. So you're paying tax on $3,000 worth of inflation that was eroded away from your purchasing power. Now, it's hard to track this because we have real terms versus nominal terms as far as inflation adjustments and all that kind of stuff. 1,000 to 10,000 sounds like a home run, but really in purchasing power, it was 4,000 to 10,000. So instead of a 10x, it's actually 2.5x, but you're paying tax on the 10x. There can be cases, depending on the numbers and the years involved, there can be cases where on real terms, you actually have a loss, but you're still paying taxes on it. So you end up with an infinite tax rate. It's something to be. This is an issue that I have become more and more upset with over the last year, and you just have to be really mindful of what's going on with the purchasing power of the dollar that you have invested. So your investment needs to outpace inflation, and obviously inflation changes. Some years it's 2%, some years it's 10%. Long-term historical average 6.5%. So if you're not beating 6.5%, then it's unlikely that you're actually coming out ahead. So that's just something to be aware of, and you want to be investing with that in mind. So if you end up having to pay tax on something where you made less than 6.5% annually, you're probably having an infinite tax rate, which is not great.